Welcome, friends, to another exciting episode of A VGM Journey. And I'm your host, The Messenger. The track that we're playing in this week's show is Title Theme from the game Game & Watch Gallery 4, and it was composed by Riyou Kinugasa and Kengo Hagiwara. Last week on the show, I played a handful of Game Boy Advance tracks from the listeners, and they were all really good. I mean, you guys really brought the fire. And in this week's show, I'm gonna bring a handful of Game Boy Advance tracks. And I made sure not to play anything from last week. So all these games are going to be completely different. And I, for the most part, stuck with first-party Nintendo games, with one exception. But I think all this stuff is really good. So I do apologize if you guys were expecting anything else. I say, let's kick things off with Sky Garden from Mario Kart Super Circuit. It was composed by Kenichi, Nishimaki, Masanobu, Matsunaga, and Minako, Hamano. That track that you just listened to, that was Sky Garden from the game Mario Kart Super Circuit, and it was composed by Kenichi, Nishimaki, Masanobu, Matsunaga, and Minako, Hamano. Mario Kart Super Circuit was the very first Game Boy Advance game that I've played, and that I got the game along with Super Mario Advance back in Christmas of 2001, which, hard to believe, that was almost 20 years ago. And I think I poured so many hours into that thing. And I thought Mario Kart Super Circuit was pretty cool because it combined elements from Mario Kart 64 and Super Mario Kart. I mean, the game mainly played like Super Mario Kart. And what was cool was all the tracks from Super Mario Kart were unlockable in Mario Kart Super Circuit. And I think a lot of the original tracks in the game, and I mean race tracks, not songs, but I do also mean the songs as well. I thought they were really cool. I think Sky Garden probably sounds the best out of all the tracks, but it's not necessarily my favorite song on the soundtrack. So even though all the songs, I think they're pretty well written and they're catchy and stuff, the only downside to these songs was the fact that they were an early Game Boy Advance soundtrack and the hardware for the GBA is not the best. So I think it was during that time where it was kind of a feeling out process. And I do wonder how different the soundtrack would have been if it was a later GBA release instead of an earlier one. I think we're going to move on from Mario Kart and go into what is possibly the biggest game of the GBA library. And I mean by like biggest as in like best selling. So I want to say these two games were the best selling games, and this is Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. This is Route 104, and this specific track was composed by Go Ichinose. That track that you just listened to, that was Route 104 from the game Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, and it was composed by Go Ichinose. I just looked it up, the best-selling GBA games of all time, and Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, they are #1, which that's what I thought. And personally, these games were my favorite Pokemon games. And it came out at a time when I was probably at the peak of my Pokemon fandom. So I dabbled with Pokemon Red and Blue and also Gold and Silver, and I really liked those games. And I was just at the right age where Pokemon was super appealing to me. And this game just made me go bonkers. This is probably the GBA game that I've played the most. I sunk the most hours into, and there was a lot to enjoy. There were a lot of like small tweaks to the game where compared to the normal Pokemon formula, where they added stuff like the ability to run, and double battles was really cool, where you could have like 2-on-2 Pokemon battles. And even one of the gym leaders was like that. So they were 2 trainers or gym leaders. And the soundtrack really just kind of hits me right in the nostalgic feels. So I believe I played both Route 119 and 120 on the show before, and those were my favorites. And 104 is a classic as well. I think I went into huge depth about Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire on my Pokemon episode with Dan Loughton. So if you wanted to hear more on that, just go check out that episode. I think we're going to move from one RPG to another RPG, and to be honest, this might be my most favorite game on the Game Boy Advance. And I'm talking about Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga. This is Popple Battle, and it was composed by Yoko Shimomura. That track that you just heard, that was Popple Battle from the game Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, and that was composed by Yoko Shimomura. I really love the Mario and Luigi games, and it's pretty nuts that even though I'm not really much of an RPG guy, this is probably one of the best turn-based RPGs I've ever played in my life. And what really hooked me was the Yoko Shimomura soundtrack, which what I think is pretty nuts about that was she was the composer for Super Mario RPG. And actually the whole game itself was developed by a lot of ex-Square developers who've also worked on Super Mario RPG. So this was kind of like a spiritual successor to that. And the turn-based battles are a lot of fun because you still have that Mario RPG like turn-based style where you would attack and with a button press you could do more damage. But what this game does differently is that you control both Mario and Luigi at the same time, and that when enemies attack, they will give off some kind of tell, and then you would have to react with whatever brother at the right time. And you could completely dodge attacks. You could avoid getting hit. And what's also really cool about this system is if you time it just right, you could actually counterattack. Like, let's just say a Goomba comes running at you. If you jump at the right time, you don't just dodge his attack. You actually jump on him as he's coming after you. And that's a system that they've had through all the Mario and Luigi games, and they've expanded on that as the series went on with having more characters or different play styles. It's really cool. And the soundtrack is, I think, one of the best on the GBA. And this specific battle is pretty cool because you are up against Popple, who is a recurring boss in that game. And he usually has some kind of a sidekick with him, which I don't want to really talk too much about. So that kind of goes into spoiler territory a little bit. And he's a boss that he's kind of a little sneaky. He'll steal items from you, and he also throws a bunch of stuff at you, and sometimes he throws mushrooms, which you could actually not try to avoid because if they touch you, they'll heal you. So that's actually pretty cool. And I think that's a game where if you've never played it or you somehow missed it, I would definitely play it. It's not that it's probably, I mean, it is my favorite Game Boy Advance game ever. And now that I'm thinking about it, I might want to do an entire episode covering the Mario and Luigi series because all the games have fantastic soundtracks. I think we're going to move on to our next track, which it was a surprising license game that I thought was okay, but the soundtrack is really good. And I'm going to play something from Robots. This is Jackhammer, and it was composed by Ian Stalker. That track that you just heard, that was Jackhammer from the game Robots, and it was composed by Ian Stalker. And that's going to just about do it for the show this week. If you like what you've been listening to, have your friends check out the show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, whatever podcatching service that you could think of. I'm more than likely going to be on there. You can email the show at vgmjourney@yahoo.com, and you could also check us out on Twitter at vgmjourney. We have a Discord server for the show, which I will provide a link for that in the show notes, where you can hang out with your fellow VGM journeymen and talk about games, music, and even look at some cool art. We've also launched a Patreon, which I will also provide a link for that in the show notes. And at the $3 tier, you can gain access to a monthly bonus show called a VGM Side Quest, which I host with my fiancée Carly. And at the $5 tier, that will grant you a special Patreon shout out on the show, just like the following people: Muddle Madness, The Last Rican, the host of VGM Fight Club, and also John Harrington, John Regan, Jesse Moore, and David Fleming of Game That Tune. So thank you guys for your pledges. We're going to play things out with one more song, and this one is a classic. This is Kraids' Lair from Metroid Zero Mission. It was originally composed by Hirokazu Tanaka, and this arrangement was done by Kenji Yamamoto and Minako Hamano. So have a good week, everyone.